Yomi is Gittin Daf Mem, Gittin 40. We're going to start on the bottom of Mem on the base at the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us an Eved she'aso rabo apoteki la'cherem, a slave whose master designated him as an apoteki. There's different types of apotekis. Apoteki is a Greek word, but it really means here that it's a designated collateral, that the slave was designated by the master, who was a debtor. He owed money, and he said this slave will be the designated collateral to pay back this loan. So vishachruru, and then subsequent, the slave was freed. Gemara is going to discuss two theories about who freed the slave. So shura sadim, by the letter of the law, ein ha'eved chayav klum. By the letter of the law, the slave doesn't owe any money. But because we want to fix the world, kofinis rabo v'aso ben chorin, we force the master to free him. We force the master to free the slave. V'kosev shtar al damav, and he writes a contract for his value. The Gemara is going to discuss who writes the contract. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, "Eno kosev el meshacher." The only one who writes the contract is the one who freed him. So the Gemara is going to discuss two main theories two theories as to how to interpret this Mishnah. Mishachraro. So first, who freed him? So Rav says, Rabo Rishon, the first master is the one who freed him. And Shura Sadid, because he's his master, he has the right to free him. And by the letter of the law, Eina Evet Chayav Kum Rabba Sheni. The master does not owe any money, the slave does not owe any money to the second master because he was freed by the first master. So the slave doesn't owe any money by the letter of the law. And this is like Rava. Why was he able to be freed if there was a lien on him? So Rava said, there are three things which break a lien, even though there are perhaps a couple more, but there are three main things in halacha that break a lien. Hekdesh, chametz, v'shechor, mafkim midei shimud. If you consecrate something to the temple, that's hekdesh. If you have chametz, and if you had placed a lien on chametz, and then Pesach comes, or freeing a slave, those three things override a lien. So the slave was technically freed, and therefore the slave owes nothing to the second master. But we're worried. We need to fix the world because we're worried that the second master will find the first slave in the marketplace. On top of now on 41a, V'yomerlo, and he'll say to him, Rashi says actually, he'll say to his children, Avdiyato, I'll say to him, you are my slave, and so therefore he'll be creating a problem for the children of the slave, and because there'll be a defect on the children. Kofinis Rabo Sheni. Therefore, under those circumstances, we force the second master, Va'osa Uto Ben Chorin. We force the second master to free him. On the top of 41a. And so therefore, the second master is the one who has to free him, even though he was really freed by the first master, but we're worried the second master is going to raise issues about him. The kosev eved shtar al damav, and because technically speaking, the slave doesn't know anything, but we tell the slave, you know what, we want you to pay back the owner because or else it's going to cause problems for you. So therefore, so therefore he should pay the second owner because the second owner really has lost that money because he made a lien on the first one. So the debtor has to pay back the creditor, but whatever the debtor doesn't pay back, the slave will have to cover. Rashbag says in that Mishnah, Eina Evet Kosev El Meshacher Kosev. Rashbag says no, the slave doesn't need to write it. The one who freed him writes it because he's the one who damaged him. So he's the one who's responsible to pay. And what's the core of this dispute? The core of this dispute is if you damage the lien that your friend has. So the Marasavar Chayav, the Marasavar Pater. So Rashbag says that if you damage the lien of your friend, you're going to be liable. And therefore, the one who damaged the lien, he has to indeed pay back the person who had the lien. Whereas the Chacham say you're exempt. And so therefore, the first owner does not need to pay back the second owner, but the slave has to do it because otherwise there's going to be defect, issues will be raised about his children. Imar Nami, indeed, we learned this. Mazik Shibuda Shel Chaver Rabbanon U'Machokes Rashbag V'Rabbanon. So that's the dispute about Mazik. We have an explicit statement that if somebody damages the lien of their friend, we've come to the dispute between Rashbag and the Rabbanon. Ua says no. Ua says, who is the one who freed him? The second master. There's the one who has the lien on the slave. He doesn't really own the slave. He has no right to free him, but he freed him. Mishachar, he sends out an ad in the New York Times, and he says, this slave is now freed. And Mishachar Rabbo Sheni, Shura Sadin, by the letter of the law, Ina Eved Chayev Klum, when it says that the slave is not liable to anything, the mitzvos, when it says in their Mishnah, by the letter of the law, the slave is not liable for anything, it means, technically speaking, the slave is not liable for mitzvos. He's not free. He's not a free person, because the second owner had no right to free him. But we can't leave the world like this. Because he's had the association with freedom. And once you have the association with freedom, we don't want to subject him to slavery. So since he has association of freedom, Kofin is Rabba Rishon, Vososo Ben Chorin. We forced the first master to free him. Because since the second master had said, you're free, and even though he didn't have the right, he now has a name associated with freedom, so we forced the first master to free him. The Kosev Shtar al Damav. And so therefore, at this point, the slave has to write a note to the slave has to write a note to his first owner, saying exactly what he lost and from which he was, whatever he was worth, more than the debt. Meaning to say that if the first owner owed the debt of, let's say, certain amount of money to the this is Rashi's explanation. It's not 100% fitting in line with the text, but Rashi says he has to pay more than the debt was worth. So if the first owner owed $1 million, but the slave was worth more than that, and so he'd have to pay the difference, because anyway, the first owner has to pay the value of the slave to the second owner. The Rashash has a problem with this, because the Pashtus of the Gemara means to say that the slave writes the shtar for his whole value, because since the lender hasn't done anything, he hasn't cost his debt at all, and so therefore he has to pay everything to the debtor. That's what the Rashash says. So then the Gemara explains. Whereas Rashbag says, "Eno kosev el meshachar kosev." No, who writes the note? The one who freed him, because he's the one who caused the problems here. What are we talking about? What's the nature of this dispute? If there's damages that are not recognizable, because you freed him, but you just said something, but where's the damage? So Rashbag says that's considered damages, and so therefore you have to the second owner has to pay the value to the first owner, because he did damages, whereas Mar Savar Roshme Hezek. But according to the Chachamim, it's not considered damages, and so therefore only the slave has to pay, but not the second owner doesn't have to pay. So the Gemara explains, just to complete this piece, the Gemara says Ula who says that the slave pays the value to the first owner, according to the Chachamim, and according to Rashbag, the second owner pays the value to the first owner. My time Karav. Why doesn't he say like Rav? So he says, because the Mishnah says, because he says, I have a problem with the word Rabo, because he says, Amachasheni Rabo Karisle, are you going to call the second one his master? Because it says in our Mishnah, Kofanes Rabo Va'oso so Ben Chorim. He forced the slave and V'kosev Shtar al Damav. So, but the second one is not really his master. He has no right. Because it says Kofanes Rabo, and Ua had said that refers to the second master. But the second master is not his master yet. He's just the person who has a lien on it. So it doesn't make sense. So, and Rav, my time, Sheni Meshachar Karisle, because the Mishnah calls him, the Rosh Shlag says, who's the one who does it? The Meshachar. But the second one cannot be the Meshachar. The first one is the only one who has the right to free him. So therefore, Rav says it refers to the first owner. So now the Mishnah discusses more about the Gemara discusses more about an apoteki. In Maraosa Sadehu apoteki lacher. Let's say you designate your field as this apoteki. Again, what do we say this apoteki is? That instead of making a lien on all your property, you made a lien on this specific part of your property. So there's different parts of apotekis. There are some apotekis where it's exclusive, and if that one piece of property you have is ruined, then the creditor can't go into your other assets. So let's say you make that's what our Gemara is going to discuss, that case. So if you make your field, let's say you have, you have one house, let's say in New York, you make the house in New York the apoteki to pay back your debt. Vishat fanar, and a hurricane comes and destroys your house. So Ami Shapir Na. So Ami, and his nickname was the good-looking guy. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Eino Gova Mishar Nechasim. He doesn't collect from he can't collect from anything else. That's what Ami Shapir No says. Since he made this apoteki, the creditor can't go to other assets. But Avuda Shmuel says Gova Mishar Nechasim. Avuda Shmuel says no, he could collect from other assets, even though he made this the apoteki. If that's ruined, he could collect from other assets. Amar Nachman Bar Yitzchak. So Nachman Bar Yitzchak has a big problem with this discussion. He says Mishum da Ami Shapir now who Omer Shmaita de Lo Shapir, and he says that just because the name is Ami, the good-looking one, he said some things that are not Shapir and that are not good. To Targim Shmaita, you can explain this teaching that it says that if you make your field an apoteki and the field's destroyed, the Rabbi Yochanan says that you can't collect from other assets. That what is that referring to? That's where it's what's called an apoteki mefurash. But that's where you specified that this is the only asset that you can collect from. If you say like that, then you can't collect from anything else because you specified and you limited it. Let's say you make your field an apoteki, and the river destroyed your field. You can collect from other assets, but if you said but if he specified, he limited it, says this is the only place you could collect it from, then you can't collect it from other assets. Tanya Idach, Bryce says, let's say you make your field an apoteki to a creditor, and also the woman has the right to make the ksuba. And they agree that at the start of the marriage that they're going to make this field an apoteki mufurish to the ksuba. Govim mishar nechasim. So if you make this field an apoteki to the creditor or to the ksuba, then you could collect from other assets. Whereas Rashbag says, so you didn't specify, in this case it was an apoteki mufurish, but Rashbag says, okay, so therefore for a balcho, for a creditor, govim mishar nechasim, you could collect from the other assets, but for an isha, but for a woman, the baseline is that she wouldn't be able to collect from other assets. The baseline is, and it's an apoteki mefurish. Because the assumption is that the woman's not going to want to go running after the courts. So we're going to make the apoteki something that's very easy for her to collect. But even though that was the assumption that was made to help her, it's actually hurting her because now she loses the ability to collect from something else because it was an apoteki mefurish. So now we're up to the bottom Mishnah. Bottom Mishnah says, Misha Chetzio Evim Chetzio Ben Chor, and somebody who's a half slave and half free. And I was thinking that that's really a metaphor for all of us. And in one sense, we're all half slaves, half free. We're trying to be free, but a lot of us are enslaved. So somebody who's a half slave, half free, he has to work for his master one day and for himself one day. That's the position of Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel says he works for his master one day and for himself one day. That's how we divide up his time. Whereas Beis Shammai says, Beis Shammai says, that's the solution to fix his master's issues. His master is going to get a value of his slave in half of the time that he works for him. But we saw Shivcha, Yavshar, but the slave himself is not, you haven't solved the problem with the slave because he can't marry a Shivcha, can't marry a Canaanite slave, Shikvar Chatzio Ben Chorim, because half of them is free, and a free Jew cannot marry a Canaanite slave. And also, Baskorin, we're on top of 41b. Baskorin Yevshar, you cannot marry a free woman. Because half of him is a slave. Yivatel, so let him not do anything, let him just sit there and not get married. Impossible. No world was only created to be fruitful and multiplying. But here, the words fruitful and multiplying, I don't believe mean to have children, because the Gemara cites, the Mishnah cites the verse, so v'ro sheves yitzara. The world was created to be settled, which means that the whole purpose of the world, this is what my Rebbe Rav Ram said, was for marriage. Because when two people get married, they create a better world, a stronger world. It wasn't to have, because otherwise the Gemara would have cited, as Tosfos notes, Tosfos offers three answers to the question. Tosfos notes, it should have cited the pasuk of Pru Ravu Molu Asaretz. So rather it says that he's not able to get married now because he's a half slave, half free, and the world was created to be settled, and the way the world is settled is through marriage. So rather, the Gemara answers, because we want to force the world to become a better place. We force the master, and we make the slave free. We make him a free person. And then the slave has to he has to pay back the master the half value. And indeed, Beis Hillel changed his mind and ruled like Beis Shammai and said you have to free the slave so that he can fulfill the mitzvah of L'so v'ro sheves yitzara. Tosfos asked the question: how can you force the master to free the slave? We said it's a sin to free a slave. And v'im tomer v'chi omer mo'adam chayit kadei she'izakeh chavercha. Do we tell a person to sin so that his friend will merit? We want the slave to fulfill the mitzvah of puravu. But in this case, we're telling the master to sin. So why do we say one person should sin so that the other person should benefit by not sinning? So, and Tosfos brings an example from the Gemara in Shabbos where if you have the opportunity to take the bread off of the oven so that the other person isn't responsible for cooking. So we don't say that one person should sin so the other person shall benefit. So therefore, Tosfos says the distinction is there the person sinned by doing something wrong by putting the bread on the oven, but here the slave has not sinned, so therefore he shouldn't be punished. Tosfos also, I said before, he gives three answers to the question: why is it that they cite the pasuk of L'so v'ra in the Mishnah, but not the pasuk of Puravu? And Tosfos says that it's because if you would be able to be Mekayim Sheves, the mitzvah of marriage at all, then if it was just for Puravu, we wouldn't have forced him to do it. That's his first answer. Then the Rivam, Rav Yitzchak Bar Mordechai, gives another answer because he says the concept of L'sheves Yitzara even applies to the tzad avdosh. It applies even to the aspect of him that's a slave, that even this Canaanite slave has this powerful purpose to get married. So, okay, so Tana Rabbanan, the Gemara now asks the question: what about the case of somebody who wants to free half his slave? Can you free half your slave? The Gemara is going to conclude that the case of our Mishnah is where there were two owners and one freed his slave and the other one didn't. But now the Gemara doesn't assume that at the outset, and the Gemara wants to know, how do you get a half slave, half free person? So somebody who frees half of his slave, Rebbe says it works. Rebbe Omer Kana v'Chachamim Omer Mol Kana. Rebbe says you can free half your slave, and Chachamim say you can't free half your slave. Amar Rabba, so Rabba says this dispute between Rebbe, who says it can work, and Chachamim say it can't. That's machokis is by a shtar. That's if you do it via contract. The Rebbe Savar v'Aftei Niftasa, it says in the pasuk, and she was not fully redeemed. Ochupasha Rona Tanwa. And or her freedom was not given to her. So it seems like there's two aspects from this verse, like there's two aspects of freeing. Hefta one if dasa, which the Gemara assumes is freeing with money, and chupasha lonitanga, which is with shtar. That's how with contract. That's how Rashi understands it. Hefta one if dasa, the gabe shifcha charufa. This is by a woman who's a Canaanite slave. That Beduya ve'ini Beduya, and we say Chatzi Shivcha Chatzi Ben Chayrin Vistam Pedia Bekeser V'Shava Keser. So she was half freed, i.e., with money, or with a shtar. Rashi says Kupashal Nitama is with a shtar. So Rabbi is of the position. Rabbi says that you can free your slave, your slave halfway. So he says Makish shtar lekesef. From this verse, we compare the contract to the money. Makesef, just like money works, you can free somebody halfway, ben kuo ben chatzil, because it says me v'aftei lo nifta. So she was partially freed. Avshtar nami ben kuo ben chatzil. So too, you can free with the contract halfway, and that's why it says ochu pasha lo nitanua. So that's the pasuk. Ochu v'sha lo nitanua. Whereas the Rabbanan would say you cannot free a half a slave. Gamri lo ami isha. You can't free a half slave with a contract because they learned it out by comparing it to a get. Ma'isha chatziolo, just like a woman can't be partially divorced. Afevenami chatziolo, so too a contract emancipation will not work by a slave halfway. Avabakasef, according to Rabbah, by money dibra kol kana. Everybody says Rabbah, that if you free the slave halfway with money, it works because it says peduya ve'ena peduya, because it says v'aftei niftasu, so she'll be half freed. The slave will be half freed with money. So, so what's the dispute between Rebbe and the Rabbanan? The dispute is the Marasavar Akesha Adifa, that Rebbe says we give power and strength to the comparison in the verse by comparing Kasef redemption to contract emancipation. Marasavar Gzera Shava Adifa, whereas the Rabbanan say we give primacy to comparing it to a get, the word la by a woman. Gemara says no. The Kuli Alma Gzera Shava Adifa. Everybody says in general that a Gzera Shava comparing two words is stronger than a Hekesh. But in this case, why do we not compare it to the Hek? Why do we not? Does Rabbi not accept Gzera Shava? Because you can break the Gzera Shava by saying Ma'al Isha Shekein Ina Yotze Bekesef, because we could say a woman. Ma'al Isha Shekein Ina Yotze Bekesef. A woman, you can't compare the case of a divorce to the case of a slave, because Ma'isha Shekain Ina Yotze B'Kesef, a woman is not cannot be released from marriage through money. Are you going to compare it to a slave? Tomer Ba'Evet Yotze B'Kesef. You can't compare it to a slave who indeed can be redeemed through money. Whereas, so that's the dispute of Rabbah. That's how Rabbah explains this dispute, that everybody agrees that a slave could be emancipated halfway with money, but the dispute is only by a contract where they can be released halfway. Whereas Rav Yosef says no, the dispute is about something else. Machokas bekasef. Rav Yosef says they're only arguing about money. The Rebbe Savar v'afteilon if those peduya ve'ena peduya. Rebbe says by money he could be partially released. Rabbanan Savar dibber Torah b'lashem adam. The Rabbanan say no, that the Torah is just speaking. It's not intended to interpret from that. The Torah is just speaking in the normal manner of a bishtar. But if it will be a contract that he's trying to release him through a contract, even everybody would say that a contract doesn't work. So according to Rav Yosef, the only dispute between Rebbe and the Rabbanan is by money, whether that works. But by a contract, everybody says it doesn't work. So the Gemara challenges Meisave. The Gemara challenges Rav Yosef. Again, what's Rav Yosef saying? Rav Yosef says that by a document, everybody says you can't be half free but what does it say in the source? That you can release half your slave with a contract. Rabbi says it works. Rabbi Omer Kane, you have to do Rav Yosef to Yufta. So it's a direct refutation of Rav Yosef. So the Gemara says, okay, we have to say that what was Rav Yosef saying? Bishtaru de pligi. So Rav Yosef was saying they must have been arguing about a contract. The Rebbe says you can release him halfway, and the Rabbanan say you can't. Avo bekasef lo pligi. But you want to say by money that they don't argue, that the Rabbanan and Rav Yosef both agree. The Rabbanan and Rebbe, would Rav Yosef say that the Rabbanan and Rebbe both agree that even the Rabbanan agree that you could be fully that you could be halfway redeemed through money. So is this therefore Rav Yosef, is he being refuted by both things? Is he being refuted by the fact that the Rabbanan that they are arguing also by shtar, that the Rabbanan say that the slave can't be half free and Rebbe says you can, and also by money that the Rabbanan say he can't be freed, and Rebbe says you can. So the Gemara says, so Rav Yosef says no. They argue by both. So why in this brisa do they only argue about a contract? To show the strength of Rebbe, to show that Rebbe says that by a contract you can be half redeemed. So why does the brisa only talk about their dispute by a contract? To show that Rebbe says this position that you can be half redeemed by a contract as well. So the Gemara says, why don't we show why doesn't the Brisa show us that they're arguing by kesef and show even the strength of the Rabbanon? To show us the strength of the Rabbanon say you can't even be half released even with money. The Gemara says, no, we'd always like to show the more lenient position because that's a more powerful position. And so therefore, the Gemara records the position of the contract to show the kula, the leniency of Rebbe. He says even by a contract you could be half released. Tashma. So the Gemara is going to cite a brisa, which is going to be a challenge to Rabbi. It says v'aftei. It says in the verse, and she is redeemed. Yachol akol. I might think this Canaanite slave is completely redeemed. Tamalomar won't iftasa. She's not completely redeemed. He won't iftasa. Yachol akol. I might think she's not redeemed at all. Tamalomar v'aftah. Okay, it said peduya ve'ena peduya. She's partially redeemed. B'kesef u'v'shava kesef with money. It says, even with the contract, and later on it says he writes for a bill of divorce. So just like later on he could be released with a contract, also here with a contract. I only see from here it could be half released with money or completely released with a contract. How do I know that a half contract also works to release her, to release the slave? So we compare the contract to money. Just like money is either partially or halfway works. Also a contract can be halfway or entirely. So the Gemara says, well, Bishlomo Rav Yosef, I can understand this price according to Rav Yosef, because he would say Basar de Yosef. This would be after Rav Yosef changed his position after the Tiyufta. And he would say, who is this price? So this price is Rebbe, who says that both by a contract and by a slave, you can be half released. El Rabba, but according to Rabba, we're going to say the Reisha is Divrei Kol. The first cause of the Brisa, which discuss is the Reisha, the first cause of the Brisa, which says that the money works to redeem her halfway, that you can redeem a slave halfway with money. That's Divrei Kol. That's according to everybody. But the Seifa, but the latter cause, which states that a contract is halfway redeemed, that would only be according to Rebbe, the Seifa Rebbe. Or is that what you wanted to say, that the first cause is according to everybody and the second cause is only according to Rebbe? Gemara says, Rabba would say, yeah, that's what we have to say. In Reisha, Divrei Kol v'Seifa Rebbe. Even though it's not elegant, we have to say that the first cause of the Brisa refers to Rebbe, and the first cause is Divrei Kol. Everybody says you can redeem with money and halfway, and the second cause goes only according to Rebbe, who says that a contract redeems the person halfway. Rav Ashi says, Rebbe he. Rav Ashi says, no, the whole Brisa is, Rav Ashi says the whole Brisa is Rebbe, and the Chachamim argue with him by shtar, and they say halfway, and they admit to him by kesef. But the whole Brisa was taught by Rebbe. So the Gemara then asks, Elamas Nisin, but our Mishnah, the Katani, so that's why the whole reason why we're citing this, our Mishnah which states, Misha Chetzio Eve Chetzio Ben Chorin, our Mishnah which says somebody is half slave, half free, Bishlam Rabba. I understand how Rabba could have such a circumstance, Mukim wa Bekesef. It could be, say, if you redeem through money. And so therefore you could be half slave, half free, V'divrei Kol. And even the Rabbanan, according to Rabba, say that you could be redeemed halfway through money. El Rav Yosef, but according to Rav Yosef, who says that only Rabbi says you can be half freed, but even the Rabbanan argue by a contract. Would you say that our Mishnah is the position of Rabbi v'lo Rabbanan? Would you say our Mishnah is the position of Rabbi, not the Rabbanan? We don't like to say that an anonymous Mishnah is Rabbi. It would have said Rabbi. So how would Rav Yosef explain our Mishnah? So Ravina says, Rav Yosef would say, like we had assumed from the beginning, because we saw the end of the Gemara already. Now we're talking about a case of a slave of two partners, and one of them freed them. But everybody says that both Rabbi and Rav Yosef would say that, even according to Rabbanon, that if one of the masters freed the slave will become free from that person's portion. And so that's how our mission is not talking about where one master freed half a slave. We're talking about where there are two masters and one of the masters freed his portion of the slave. So we'll stop here. And I just want to say,